everyone. Welcome to Just Say It, the podcast by communicators for communicators. On this show, we have in-depth conversations with journalists, messaging experts, designers, marketers, leaders, and managers, and unpack their wisdom and experience. Each episode is designed for strategic communicators looking to level up and advance their careers. I'm your host, Rochelle Bedell. As a contributing artist to publications like Politico, Time Magazine, The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, Esquire, GQ, and over 300 others worldwide, Brian Stauffer's illustrations are best known for their conceptual take on social issues. Through a unique combination of hand-drawn sketches, painted elements, and scanned found objects, Brian's work bridges both the traditional and digital realms. Brian has won multiple awards for his work, including being chosen as the cover artist for the 200 Best Illustrators Annual. Before taking on illustration full-time, Brian worked as an art director for a variety of news publications. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I don't know who that guy is, but he sounds great.
He sounds amazing. So tell me, you worked as an art director for many years before you pivoted into illustration full-time. Can you share with us a little bit about that journey, your background, and how you ended up as a freelance illustrator?
I wouldn't say it was many years. It was about five and a half years, probably. I started in school as a music major. For anybody who's wondering, like, oh, what happens if what I'm doing isn't the thing I want to do? That's great. Then you know you don't want to do that. I took music classes through junior high and high school, and it was one of those things that I enjoyed, and it was kind of easy. Then what happened was when I got to college, the level of what people were doing there, not so much playing, but just their commitment and their excitement, the contrast became really obvious to me. And I thought, I don't feel this way about this. I'm not going to feel this way about this. And it wasn't that I was afraid of it or whatever. It was just I did not feel like I wanted that particular challenge. And, I was practicing 6 hours a day and doing all the things that you do. And I just thought, I want to feel the way they feel, but I want to feel it about something else. And so both my parents are artists, and I decided, well, after a couple conversations with them, that I would switch to art. And to me, art was always just way too frightening, way too kind of obtuse. Like, how do you find a shape to this thing and actually figure out what you would do life-wise? I thought, well, graphic design is interesting, and I'll try graphic design. And so after my first critique in a 2D design class, when we put all of our work up on the board, I was like, it was one of those moments where it was kind of like, oh yeah, like, oh, so this is what feeling competitive feels like. So I just was not a competitive person in a lot of ways. I was very much a loner. With this, I felt like, okay, when I put work up here, I want it to be the best. The contrast was striking. And so it didn't mean it made it easy or anything. It actually made it harder, but at least it was a kind of hard task that, I was kind of up for. So I went through a graphic design program and actually only took one required illustration class, graduated with a graphic design degree from the U of A in Tucson. During my last year, I kind of was thinking, I need to find ways to stand out and to try to maybe do a bit more than the norm. And a couple really good friends, Herb and Carrie Stratford now, they were a year or maybe a year and a half ahead of me in college, had started a magazine, and they were going to hand it off, and they handed it off to me. And then I produced an issue of that outside of my regular class work. And it ended up getting a bunch of awards and things, and, kind of kick things off, and it set me off in this tone that, okay, I need to do what I'm doing, but then maybe I need to spend time trying to find ways to keep pushing myself. And my first couple jobs, the people that owned the businesses were very nice, and it wasn't their fault. It was just a horrible match for me, graphic design wise. I was just like, I don't care about shopping malls. I don't care about real estate and things like that these were the clients for these agencies. So after a couple of years, I went and worked with the New Times newspaper and thought, well, I'll do this for a little while. And that's when things really switched into editorial. All the while working in those crappy jobs, though, I was working with another friend to create another magazine outside of our work hours. And we did it under a shoestring budget with an extension cord and a computer plugged into, a tough shed in Phoenix, Arizona. And we worked every evening from about 7 o'clock until about 3 o'clock in the morning. And then we'd sleep for a couple hours and go back to work and then repeat that. And we produced this magazine that won a bunch of national awards and things. So it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of good stuff. And I started seeing this trend towards magazines.
So before you move on in your story, where were you selling this magazine? Where were you distributing it? How did you get people's eyes on it?
Luckily, I was not publisher or ad sales side of this thing because I just don't have that in me. But a really great entrepreneurial publisher, Robert Centenary, who I think publishes still a publication in Tempe, maybe called Java. I can't remember now. He had this idea of doing, kind of an arts publication, an Arizona arts publication. And he had a lot of connections with galleries and worked with a number of freelance writers. I met him through another designer, Dan Simo, who had started the project and then moved out of town. And very quickly, I realized, okay, so this is not a place with any kind of budget for art. We're going to work with the art that comes in for the people that we're profiling, people like Annie Leibovitz, people like that from pop culture who were coming into the area in Arizona, and we were profiling them. And then I was having to kind of make up things to kind of turn these spreads into things that were interesting. So I started, using found objects, and it was really the seeds of what I do now were kind of sown there, because I didn't want to just lay out pages. I wanted the spreads themselves to be conceptual and actually communicate part of the experience of the person that was being profiled. And it became this really cool kind of, workshop. There was no committees. There were three of us basically. And so if I could convince the three of us that this was the right way to go, we would do it. So we ended up taking a lot of chances and being kind of bold with it. And I found myself at every stage of my life after that wanting to kind of replicate that experience. So going into the newspaper, they had a redesign that was done. It was good. It was a really nice redesign, but they had left the opening spreads of illustrations of stories, these long features. They had left them to basically kind of be these big, introductions to these long form stories that were incredible investigative journalism and, just written by brilliant writers.
And this is when you started working for the newspaper, right? That you switched from that previous, was it a graphic design job, and you did the magazine on the side, and then you moved to the newspaper?
Exactly. And I continued for, I want to say 2 years, once I started working at the newspaper, to also do that other magazine on the side, just because it was just too much fun and it was such a great experience. What happened was I ended up building this relationship with the editors at this publication, and I think they were previously maybe less interested in the art director / designer being a part of the messaging, more so than just like, here, put it in the page, make it look good, give us a good headline we can read, and get out of the way. Over a pretty quick period of time, I kind of built a trust with them where it was like, look, we're going to have this layout say something about this. And that's when there was another element added to this, which was, okay, so if you're going to say something about this piece that's been written by this writer who's worked on it for a couple months and poured themselves into it, you can't sabotage it. You have to add something to it. You have to pitch this thing and present it in the right way. So it's a huge responsibility. And I really like that. It's when I first started feeling like a journalist more than a designer.
Can you help us understand what you mean when you say you take the layout and you add something to the piece through the layout? What does that mean? How is that different from what we typically see in a newspaper?
You used to see it more so in a lot of publications like GQ, and Rolling Stone was the big one, where they would have these opening spreads that would have maybe a photo or an illustration of the person or the subject. And then the typography, the way that the type was selected and arranged and interacting, graphically with the text, it was creating this kind of like a universe of the world of this story. One example is one of our writers did a piece called Trip to the Big House, and it was about what people wanting to visit this prison in Florida, what they had to go through to get there and to get in to see their loved ones, and how they would do this on a regular basis. And so it involved all these multiple bus rides and things. And so it was called Trip to the Big House. And there was a scene where this writer went in and did this visitation and described it as if she had passed through walls that were maybe 100 feet thick, even though they weren't, just this sense of being completely isolated. So what I did was I printed out on the computer like a thick black border that I, made in Adobe Illustrator. and printed it out really tiny and started blowing it up on a Xerox machine, blowing it up, it's getting all this kind of interesting artifact to it. And then I took and cut this thing apart and started putting it back together kind of incorrectly. In the end, there was this gigantic thick border that ran across 2 pages with the title kind of crammed inside of it and a little bit of text that was pushed right up against the edges of the wall. And so it felt like a monolithic, dysfunctional, because it was all kind of deconstructed and then put back together, and very cramped kind of environment. That's what I was trying to have this layout communicate before you even read the first word. It was, this feels confined, this feels impenetrable, and it feels dysfunctional.
So interesting. So through the layout, so you're not even providing necessarily an illustration like what we see on the wall behind you, but rather it's using this layout to evoke this emotional response. It does have a little bit of artistic feel to it. It does have maybe a little bit of design to it. Like you said, it's really the layout of the design and the title, and the magazine's willing to give you this space to evoke this feeling in people before they even start reading.
Right. If you're a writer and you trust that and you like it, you realize that a reader flipping through a publication will find something like that much more compelling and much more of a hook than, an entire, 3-column paragraphs of type with a title on it. And, no offense to like the New Yorker and publications like that who do that. They know their audience and their audience likes that, and they don't need to do it some other way. I would never correct them. But in this case, these weeklies were free weeklies and people are flipping through just to kind of see what's going on. And yes, they are picking it up for the journalism. But, when I see it in other people's publications, I think about all the thought that went into it. And I think about the kind of intelligence of it, the kind of deliberateness of it. Okay. And I think that reflects really well on the content of the publication. I think it tells the reader, we think you'll get this. We think you'll appreciate this. Where you can put a message out and the audience can see it and kind of complete it and absorb it. The bond that you make between an audience and a publication, or audience and whatever the message is, whatever form it is, I don't know, just the more powerful that is, the more compelling it is.
In the way you described even that one example, just in your description of it, you evoke an emotional response in me. Like, it's so powerful to see things visually. So I can only imagine how fun that must have been and invigorating to be able to use your creativity in this way that's not just putting blocks of text and images on a page, which is your typical graphic design. So to take it from here, you're working at the newspaper, it gives you this opportunity to be a little more artistic and to really start framing stories in design ideas, if that makes sense. That's kind of what I'm hearing. Okay, so let's take it from there.
I had not thought before working at this newspaper would be something as foundational as it was. I thought that newsprint was kind of a cheap throwaway kind of thing, and that that it wasn't where really quote unquote meaningful graphic design would be done or something. And it turns out that both things exist. I would work on these layouts and see these and really feel this whole thing, and then 2 days later, after the issue came out, you could see that same spread in a gutter that's been run over by a vehicle or something like that, and like it was used and was thrown away. And I think to some people that cheapens the idea of whether it was worth ever putting that kind of effort into it in the first place. And I think the exact opposite. I thought it was liberating. It meant the week's going to come and go. We're going to do this thing, whether we want to or not. The paper's coming out, the train is moving, and I'm just going to hop on this thing. And I will be happy some weeks and less happy others. It'll be this kind of laboratory of, just trying and experimenting. And what happened was very quickly was that people who were working at big slick magazines were contacting me and saying, how are you getting these done? How are they letting you do this? And I'd said, well, I have good relationships with my editors and trust me, and I had an opportunity to show my portfolio of that work to Fred Woodward and Gail Anderson at Rolling Stone. And this was in their prime, just being everywhere. They were doing the most amazing work. And they sat down with me on a Friday in New York City and spent an hour and a half talking with me about the work. And Fred said, this is really special. I'm not totally comfortable with that kind of acknowledgement. These are people at the top of the profession. They get it and they get me.
Yeah, these are guys at Rolling Stone magazine talking to you about this work that you're doing at a newspaper. That's amazing.
it's one of those things where you feel super nervous ahead of time. And then when you walk in and you start talking, you realize that you're speaking in ways that you don't usually in an element that you feel 100% comfortable with. And you're like, why do I feel so comfortable talking to these people? Well, one, they're really amazing people who weren't like so hyper full of themselves that they could sit there and look at layouts that were done, on newsprint or whatever, and they didn't care.
So you have this meeting with these guys from Rolling Stone magazine asking about how you're doing, what you're doing, how you're able to get the latitude to do what you're doing. And then where do you go from there?
I went to an AIGA lecture that Fred was giving in Miami at a convention there, AIGA, American Institute of Graphic Arts. He gave a lecture, and I thought, well, I'm going to go there and maybe try to meet him. And I sat there in this room with, I don't know, maybe 50 or 100 people, and he went through his work and was talking about it. And he was just an open book. I was completely struck by that, like the complete lack of like artifice. So I went up afterwards and I was trembling, but it took everything I could do to go up afterwards and introduce myself. And at that point, he had said, oh yeah, I saw the newspaper that you do. And oh, so you're the art director. He's like, yeah, well, so if you ever come to New York, give me a call. And I took him up on that and, probably hounded him about it. I guess the reason I mention that is I didn't see very many people going up and talking to him and afterwards. And I was surprised by that. And what I found is that there have been a number of points in my life where I kind of stepped forward when other people didn't. And I'm always amazed by that because it's such a powerful way to, I don't want to sound too much like, oh, you want to use people, but here you have this person in front of you and, to make contact with them, it's such a missed opportunity to not try to connect in some way with someone. And I'm not talking about like, here, what can you give me? Just, I'm going to go see that this is a human being. And it's a human being. Okay, so now it's a human being. And now I'm a human being. And guess what? What one person can do, another person can do. And all of a sudden you're now, see yourself in places that you hadn't before.
Can I say something about that real quick before you move on? That's been one of the really interesting things for me about this podcast. We came up with this idea for the podcast, I don't know, probably 8 months ago when we were talking about our master's thesis project. As I started researching and trying to figure out how do you start a podcast, how do you find guests, I happened to connect with someone who does podcasts for a living for B2B companies. I was talking with him and he said, I really encourage you to reach out to people who are really well developed in their careers and people who are really putting their stuff out there. He goes, you may find that they're more likely to be on your podcast than you think because they already have an opinion and they're already sharing it. And I was like, that sounds really scary. I'm not sure I want to do that, right? I'd rather stay in my own little bubble with people that I know. This experience has been so enlightening to me because I've had the same experience that you had when you walked up to that Rolling Stone creative director, because everyone has been so supportive and so willing to talk with us and so willing to share their experiences and their expertise. And I was just like, wow, this world is a great place full of people who are just really great people and just want to help and who like meeting other people. And I don't know why I didn't think that was the case, but I've been enlightened. It's been really great fun. So I share in that with you. And I'm just glad to be on this side of it where I'm like, oh, now I can reach out to people and most likely I can have a good experience. And for those that don't respond to me, oh, well, there'll be someone else who does.
If this is the right way to put it, but I think I have benefited from not knowing what I don't know, meaning that I'm willing to kind of put myself out in front of people at times when maybe I'm not ready for it yet. Or someone that I want to work with. And I think, well, they haven't ever called me. If they wanted to, they would. Well, they don't know who you are. So introduce yourself. I think there are times where I have definitely stepped into a situation where I'm like, oh crap. My first illustration for Rolling Stone was my first freelance illustration, which is not the way it works usually. And that's not a statement about quality of my work being so special. It was more that I thought for some reason, having done 3 illustrations for myself at the newspaper, that, oh, hey, I'll share these with Fred and Gail. And I send them these little postcards. And a week later, I get a call. Oh, so you're doing illustration now. That's cool. And I'm like, yeah, I am. Oh, here, how about a full page for a movie review? And I was like, okay. And then, multiple days of not being able to sleep and throwing up and going, oh my God, what have I done? What have I done? And then rising to that occasion and doing it, that launched my career. I think that a more measured person would say, I'm not ready yet. I need to have a full portfolio of 10 pieces, and I need to have done this, and I probably should work my way up to that. And, I'm a little bit like, like the guy that shows up at Mount Everest and says, I'm climbing that. And you're like, well, what have you done before that? And you haven't. But then he goes and does it.
I love that story so much. And just to go over the timeline, so you saw this guy at a conference, you went and said hi to him, then you went and visited him in New York. How soon after that?
Maybe a month and a half after that.
Okay. And then did you take your designs with you?
I did. I took this huge clunky portfolio of mounted spreads on Mapboard, like what you would take like as a student. And it was an amazing thing just to walk through the doors and see they have a gigantic stone there. It's like this massive, like, I don't know, 8 foot wide, big rock. And you walk past the walls with like all these amazing illustrations by people who Philip Burke and people who were all my idols. And then there you are sitting in the inner sanctums of Rolling Stone. And I remember just thinking, whoa, you are so over your head right now. And then we started talking and looking through the work, and it was just, this is really special. And I was like, oh my God, so it was a big deal. And, so that particular project came out, and then someone from GQ called them and said, who is Brian Stauffer? And can you give me his number? And I did a couple pieces for them, and and it kind of just built pretty quickly from that point on.
At this time, you still had your full-time job and you were doing this illustration on the side. How long did that last? When did you launch into freelance full-time, and what gave you the security, or what pushed you into going full-time freelance?
So I worked at the newspaper till the end of 95 or 96. Just as I was leaving there, I had done enough of these pieces that I thought, I'm going to do this big self-promotion piece, which I did. But I started working for a design firm that I had always admired. I went there and started doing these corporate projects for them. It was called Pink House. At some point, maybe I was there for only maybe 9 months or something, I was like, yeah, I don't want to do this. A friend who I've done animation stuff with said, hey, I'm starting this internet company. Do you want to move to New York? You can do your freelance on the side. And so we moved up to Connecticut and New York, and I started doing both of those at the same time. And the same thing kept happening kind of over and over again, which was I was doing this thing to make money on, to kind of pay the bills, and then the illustration work, and the contrast of enjoyment between the two became greater and greater each time. So I kept leaving these things to just kind of focus more on the illustration. And so I guess it was in I want to say early 98 that I said, okay, I'm just going to do illustration, and did so. And kind of from that point on, I still did the occasional design project, but more so like, oh, this sounds like fun. I'll do this because it's fun, not because, oh, I need to pay the bills. So, but it's something that I tell, students all the time, which is, one of the worst things you can do is try to make the thing you're passionate about to make all your money for you when you're starting out. Because what ends up happening is you start resenting that passion, or you start believing, unless it takes off, you start believing that it's not sustainable or something. And the truth is, it is sustainable. It just needs to be built over time. And so freelance is a very difficult thing to do. And I'm certainly not the kind of person who ever had any kind of appetite for doing that. Like if ever asked that I would do that when I was young or in college, I would have said, no way. I want a paycheck. I want to know where it's coming from. And I want to, that wasn't for me. But I found out over time.
So let's dive into that a little bit more, your illustration and design. And tell me, in your opinion, what makes for a compelling image? And how do you translate a message or a story into a compelling visual or image?
Well, it depends, what the subject of that is. So, or like what category it falls into, whether it's, political or humanitarian or, celebrity or that kind of a thing. What I think makes a really powerful illustration, it's not so much a specific thing, but it's what I feel when I see it. And when I see it, I see the artist's kind of mind at work. And it's kind of like what I was saying before, like, wow, this is really deliberate. Even if it's a tired cliche, but turned on its end in a way that is so incredibly appropriate. So it's not that it's like hyper original thinking, but just really smartly thought out work.
I saw on your Instagram page a recent illustration that you did that was for an article about the refugees in the European Union. And the illustration showed refugees in a boat. It used the imagery of the European Union flag, which has a blue background and a yellow star, and the yellow star comes up through the boat to provide the mast of the boat. So maybe we can use that image as an example of how you came up with that idea, why it's compelling, or how you made it compelling.
Okay, so that piece in particular was a really fast one, which a lot of my work is. So we're talking about, day or two kind of thing from start to finish. I get really drawn into these humanitarian stories, and I recommend that people seek the subjects that they're interested in. They'll do better work for it. But in this case, here's the subject of there's this massive humanitarian crisis of refugees that are, pouring in to the EU nations, and some are doing a lot of the heavy lifting and some are not as open to it. And so it's creating a crisis, a political crisis within the EU as to kind of how they can figure out how everyone can help bear the burden of this, and so that it, that it really works for everyone, especially the refugees. And so what I do is this sounds kind of like it's a very kind of buzzy word to use empathy now, but I swear I've got footage of me talking about this 10 and 15 years ago. That's what it is for me. What I do is I try to visit the minds of people all throughout the editorial process. So why is Politico Europe doing this story? What were they thinking? What are they hoping for? What are they looking for a takeaway from this article? What's in their mind? What was it like for a writer to focus on this? And in this case, they weren't talking with refugees. So it wasn't like they were experiencing the refugee crisis. But in my mind, I go, okay, what does it feel like to be one of these people? And I think of just the simple little hardships that we have, and then you magnify it by what would it take for you to have to leave and actually to put your family in a potentially lethal position in order to get to another place. And what does that feel like? How do you feel in that situation? And then what does it mean if the people who find you or receive you are, happy or not happy about that? And what does it feel like to be in that system? And also, what does it feel like to be a leader of a country who maybe has an agenda of things that they want to do to better their country? And they know that when they address the issue of refugees, it's going to make some people happy and some people angry. And what does that mean to their political career? All these things are things that circle around this subject. So you can't just draw a little sad, mopey illustration of a refugee and go, oh, look at the poor refugees. I mean, that is condescending to them and doesn't reflect the complexity of the entire story that's being written. In my case, I had an early draft of the story before they talked as much about the political aspect as they did just about the scope of the crisis. I think they even used the headline, "Refugee Crisis is Boiling Over for EU Nations," or something like that. And so I thought, okay, well, let me take a little boat and show that this little boat is not effectively handling this massive crisis. And so I can take something, if overloaded, is dangerous and causes physical death to those people, but I can take that little boat and have that little boat now be the metaphor for the entire program of how to receive refugees. And so now this boat has 2,000 people that are kind of trying to funnel down into it, and it looks as precarious as it is, and the people start looking almost like cattle and objects and not personable and individual human beings. And, to me, it was like, oh, this is perfect. And so I, sent that into them as a sketch. The art director loved it. We moved forward on it. Then the piece comes in and we realize, oh, they've pivoted the content to being more about the political process within the EU. And so we didn't have a lot of time, so I couldn't just completely reinvent the entire thing. So I started taking the image and thinking almost like a raw material, like I used to with a Xerox machine and a printout of something at the other magazine. And I was like, what can I do with this? If I have this images of these people, and if I have, I have the flag, the EU flag, a star or whatever, and I start seeing, okay, well, there could be a star that's actually penetrating from underwater up through the boat. And now it almost looks like a sail, but it also looks like it could be holding it back. If it's, is it a sail? Is it an impediment? But one thing it is definitely doing is piercing this issue of an overcrowded boat. And it's not the same boat, and it is the same people, but not as many of them. And we were able to pull that all together. Students always want like a formula to this. I don't have one, and I don't approach it that way, other than to say most creative people coming into something like this have a tremendous amount of self-doubt or anxiety. For me, the greater the issue, the greater the anxiety, because the responsibility is larger and the opportunity is greater. So you don't want to miss a chance to do a really powerful and compelling image. You don't want to do what's been done before. And, there are all different reasons why an image can get harpooned. I can't give someone a formula, because I think if you have a formula that you follow every single time, your work becomes formulaic. And yes, you want people to know how to think about your work, and you want people to say, oh, I like the way Brian thinks about these kinds of things, but I don't want them to call me and say, what, I bet he's going to do this because he always does this kind of thing, da, 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 da. What I like is that they call me and they say, we're taking basically a leap of faith here. We don't know what you'll come up, but we like the way you think about these things, or we like the fact that you treat sensitive subjects carefully, but still say something bold with them. And those are the ones that are the most interesting to me. Things like, when George Floyd was killed, the piece I did for the NAACP on that. And it was just like, I'm sitting here juggling, like, okay, I'm trying to juggle privilege and race and blind spots and, cliche and all this stuff. And it's like a minefield of potential problems. And it's really exciting. And I love it. I really do. I really like that.
I think one of the things that's so compelling about your work, it's well researched, right? You look at the issue from all angles. As you mentioned before, you look at it with empathy. You're looking at how will the victims view this? How will the audience view this? How will the magazine view this? How do we navigate this such that it displays the complexity of the issue? But then you take these symbols and the different stars that you use, the boat that you use, you take these symbols and you use them to represent such huge issues and such huge ideas. And it just makes your images really powerful. It's amazing.
I'm probably lazy in some ways, because the truth is that these symbols have immense momentum behind them that's been building for years before I ever came into the picture. So these things mean something to people already. They become a shorthand, and the same image can mean two different things to two different groups and reveal the difference in the gap between them, because two different groups see a flag one way as something to kneel for, and the other people see it as something that is sacred and can't be touched. And by using something like that, you get to tap into all of that emotion, all of a person's bias, the images and the symbols, the things that we decide to define our culture by, ourselves by, all those things. That's just like that power is just there.
I want to switch gears a little bit. I know you had mentioned that you learned you had ADHD later in your career, and I was hoping you might be able to tell us the story of how you discovered it and how ADHD is actually plays to the strengths of your current career in illustration.
What happened was, about 5 years ago, had just kind of this very big depression that hit. And I had been living the bulk of my career in kind of this long free fall from the top of a huge tree, and just kind of grabbing at branches on the way down and going from deadline to deadline, and producing, I don't know, oftentimes like 10 or 15 images in a week, just very little sleep, maybe drinking too much, certainly not eating very well, and all these things. And it just felt completely out of control. Coincidentally, as my kids were getting ready to go off to college, my wife basically getting her master's in educational therapy, which she did, and has a thriving practice now. It's been amazing. At one point, she came to me and said, I think this might apply to you. And I know that a therapist listening to this would be like, oh, this is like when someone, reads WebMD and thinks that everything they read they have. But in fact, she was looking at, from an assessment standpoint, that she'd taken a class about doing assessments. And she was like, I think you have ADHD. And I think she thought that she didn't understand that in the past. And I certainly felt that. And what's interesting is that I used to be able to produce this massive amount of work and on these very difficult topics on very short time and be relatively on it schedule wise, missing the occasional deadline here and there, but nothing like really missing a deadline. Around me was chaos. So my studio would be trashed. I wouldn't have sent out an invoice in 3 months or something. Work was great. There was this incredible intense thing going on. And then everything else was kind of start and stop. So I'd have a bunch of half finished, I'm making this table, or I'm doing woodworking here, or I'm getting certified for paragliding halfway, or I'm getting, this, doing that. Like all these things were kind of partially done. I was struck by the feeling like that I was a really immature, at the time, 52-year-old person. And like looking at people who were much more organized and mature, it just became kind of obvious that I needed to talk with people. So I went through and did a whole battery of tests. It took like about 6 weeks. And it was interesting. They were like, oh yeah, you're definitely attention deficit, not hyperactive, but attention deficit is a big thing. And I went through, a series of kind of classes and workshops and things, and took some medication and things, and it's made a huge difference in just in the sense of knowing your own mind. And this is kind of what I try to tell students. Our world in general, people are comparison like obsessed, and it's really dangerous and really hazardous to compare yourself with people, because you really don't know anything about the people you're comparing yourself to other than what you've attributed to them. So you see someone that looks like they've got everything together. You have no idea whether they do or not. You compare yourself and say, I don't have everything together. Why does everybody else? But I don't. And so when you learn your mind, you say, oh, now I know why I am doing this. It's not because it's a character flaw. It's not because I have a moral failing or a lack of willpower. In my mind, as long as I was getting work and doing work on a rapid pace, then I was a good person. And, it doesn't really have anything to do with that. I needed to be more well-rounded and needed to be taking care of myself in ways that could sustain that good work. And it took a long time to do that. So when I say to people, know your own mind, I'm saying, let's say a student is sitting in class and I give an assignment and they have 20 minutes before class is over and they're like, okay. And they get the assignment and they're just like, ooh, I don't know what I'm going to do or whatever. And they look over and they see another student that's over there sketching away already, kind of using every minute of the class to kind of do their thing. Their assessment is, why am I not doing that? What's wrong with me that I'm not using every minute of the day? Well, I would say that if it were me, I probably was pretty overwhelmed and already tapped out mentally by the end of that class. And that what I needed was a break.
I love this idea of knowing your mind and really accepting yourself for the way that you work and the things that you need in your work and, what invigorates you. And I know when we discussed it before, you had talked about how you spent so much time in these careers where it was just a very frustrating experience because you were working with really long deadlines and working with really large teams and things like that. And now that you're in this freelance world, it's really tight deadlines and it's you and this small team, right? You send it to the editors and they give you feedback, and then you just have a very short timeline to finish that and get it done, which works really well with people who have attention deficit disorder, right? Like that short timeline, you can get it done, move on, and you don't have to spend these large amounts of time on it, which doesn't work well for attention deficit disorder. And I just think it's really important and really inspiring when people really look at that and take stock of that in their own selves, whether or not they have attention deficit disorder. We all work differently. We all have different needs. And so we pay attention to that and we listen to ourselves. And then we find those opportunities where we can really grow and shine. Tell me, I want to switch gears a little bit. Have you tell us a little bit of your advice for those looking to launch a career in illustration? As we talked about before, I have a daughter who's in an art program for undergrad, and she would love to have a career in illustration. But it seems like illustration is just illustration singularly as a career is a really hard career to launch into. So I wanted to get your advice for those who are looking to start out in the career. What advice do you have for those who are looking to have a career similar to yours?
In general, especially with creative careers, one of the things that's the most important is that if you haven't spent time, but if you work on imagining yourself in that environment, experiencing that life and experiencing what does it feel like to be an illustrator? What does that look like? What would a day in illustration be like. If you're doing that, you're more inclined to create that. If I ask, why do you want to be an illustrator? And they say, I like to draw. It's like, well, I like to eat, but I'm not going to be a chef. I like to watch movies, but I'm not going to be a director. What is it about this thing? Well, sometimes it's what it was like for me with music. It's just what I've done and what makes me feel comfortable and natural. I like it, and I don't know what else I want to do. That's not the beginning of an illustration career, and it's not the end of it either. It would not be the answer that I would accept for myself if I were, looking to make a commitment on something. It sounds very kind of unsure, and maybe will become more sure over time. If you're a young person and you love to draw, or you love a particular type of, artwork or something, and you want to do that, then start doing it. And start doing it in your own way before you're taught by anyone. Start just trying to do it and see how you feel when you do it. How do you feel when a drawing isn't going well? So do you stick with it, or do you abandon it? Do you put it down and go do something else and avoid it? Or do you find yourself with a level of determination that, you know what, I'm going to try this. It may suck still, but I'm going to at least try it. And if it doesn't work, I'm going to rip it up and throw it in the trash can, and I'll start another one after I take a break and go do something else or whatever. That's somebody who I would say is, has a good mindset towards, okay, I want to do this thing. You have to want to do it. It's not, oh, you're really gifted, you should be an artist. I don't believe that people are gifted. I believe that there are people who find the gift is that they find the thing that they're willing to kind of go through discomfort and hardship, enough that they can make it through it and achieve something.
This is such great advice. Thank you so much for that. Let's move into our Just Say It questions. And these are the questions that we ask at the end of every interview. The first one is, if you could give one piece of advice to your younger self when you were just getting started in your career, what would it be?
I think it would be to enjoy where I was at the moment. But I remember kicking myself over and over again for not being outside on the weekends. And like, if I blew an entire day laying on the couch or sleeping late. And my mother, who is very driven and constantly was is still reinventing herself, never peaking as a person, doing her best work in age, said, well, maybe that's just the way you do it. Maybe you just work really, really hard and then you lay on the couch for a day. Like, why can't you just accept that right now? Why does it have to equal bad person or I'm doing it wrong or whatever? So try to stay in the moment. The other thing I would tell them is do more than what's expected of you. Like, do more. And that's like, I know that's kind of like, oh, why is he saying this? It's the last thing I want to hear. The things that I did above and beyond or outside of what was expected have been the things that have made the biggest leaps for me in my career. And that's because when I do it for myself and not for someone else, I am less anxious about it. There's less anxiety and more exploration and more play that happens.
Such great advice. Thank you for that. Our second question is, what is one habit that you do daily that you would recommend to our listeners?
One, I'm like an early riser. I love to get up early. And I know that other people aren't going to do that. And I don't think it matters when you get up. But when you do, where you get all into screens and everything else, stop and take even like 15 minutes and just look around you and look at what you have and look at kind of where you're going, and in the most positive way, without pumping yourself up, genuinely appreciate kind of your good fortune. Instead of waking up in the morning and going, I'm so stressed out at this art school and to stop for a second and go, oh my God, this is such an amazing opportunity. I never thought I would be able to go to a school like this. And I'm going to do the best I can today to take some very deliberate moments first thing in the day that are not about free falling, that are not about like what could go wrong and what you're afraid of and who's doing what that's better than you or anything, but just look where I am. My God, look where I am. And this comes from, again, only 5 years of practice, but I was at the time anyway, the top of my career, making more money than I had ever made, and certainly more than I could have ever thought. Everything looking perfect and feeling like an utter failure and feeling like the world was hostile and that I was on the way out and on the way down. And it had everything to do with what I focused on, which none of it was the actual reality of where I was at.
This is such great advice, just to take that time every morning to gain that perspective of what's important, what am I grateful for? And then you start your day just with this idea of this is what's important to me. And it almost provides this focused attention on those important things. And you don't get so hyper focused on the things that aren't important.
Just imagine, as a creative person, if I wake up in the morning and I think, God, I have these illustrations that I don't want to do because I don't care about this topic. And I do that and then go step into the studio. What am I going to produce? I'm going to produce probably the bare minimum stuff that's good enough. The client will be thrilled still, but it will be me kind of fulfilling an obligation versus, God, I'm so lucky that at the end of this project, I'll be making, enough money to pay my mortgage this month just by doing this thing right here. And these guys are going to be happy and they're probably going to call me back again. And now I can build on this as part of my career. Those two things are both kind of accurate in a way. But one is, I'm still not looking forward to it, but I can see that it has this really important part of a bigger part of building a career and a life.
Yeah, that reframing can make a huge difference. Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. I so appreciate you sharing your stories and your expertise with us. For our listeners, if you want to learn illustration with Brian, he teaches at the California College of Arts in San Francisco. Brian, thank you. Where can our listeners find you if they want to connect with you?
Well, they can go to my not so updated website, brianstauffer.com, or they can find me on Instagram. Stauffer Studio is my Instagram handle. So I love to talk with people and they can email me, brian@brianstauffer.com. Sometimes I may take a couple days to respond to people, but I absolutely love to connect with people.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. Have a wonderful day. And we'll be sure to put all those links in our show notes.
Great. Thanks so much.
We have additional resources and links in our show notes at justsayitcommunications.com. Transcripts are up on the website and the video is up on YouTube. My team is Andrea Casas-Topete, Zara Momini, and Shinga Yoshimine. And my name is Rochelle Vidal. If you enjoyed this show, please like and share it. And don't forget to apply what you learn on the show. We hope you'll join us again soon for another conversation.